Hi, this is Paul. I usually keep pretty close tabs on Jordan Peterson's YouTube feed, but I woke up early this morning, and I usually don't like to get out of bed early because that disturbs my wife, and her alarm goes off early because she has to go in and teach school. And so that's a good time for me to sometimes listen to a podcast or something like that. And if I fall asleep, no big deal. If I stay awake and I listen to the whole thing, that's fine too. And so someone had mentioned somewhere that there was something in the recent Jordan Peterson Bitcoin conversation that pertained to my work. And so I was kind of curious about that. And so I pulled up the Jordan Peterson podcast feed, and surprise, meaning, awe, and conceptualization of God, part 1. And well, this wasn't on the YouTube feed. And I know that just briefly a title popped up on the YouTube feed and was withdrawn right away. Jordan obviously has someone managing his podcast feed. And what was interesting about this is that this is a compilation of a bunch of things. And there's Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke. There's Jordan Peterson and Bishop Barron. There's Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Pageau. There's Jordan Peterson and Andrew Blackmore. And there's Jordan Peterson and the professor from Johns Hopkins of psychedelics. And they're all in this, but it's a compilation of all of these, and it's put together very well. And I was quite curious about, well, who did this? Who put this compilation together? Because I don't really think Jordan Peterson is taking time to go past and look for clips in his old material and put them together. So obviously someone working for him is, and whoever did this did a really good job, because it makes a nice piece. I was tempted to go through the videos and kind of make a video, but I suspect that on the video feed, something like this might be coming out too at some point. Maybe not. I don't know. But the audio feed itself was quite good. And it touched on a bunch of the things that I've been thinking, so I thought might do a little bit of running with it.
Because it seems to me that that's something that I've done, at least in part. And that it isn't obvious to me that anyone wants to live a meaningless existence. I don't think you can live a meaningless existence without becoming corrupted, because the pain of existence will corrupt you without a saving meaning.
Now it's very interesting, because once you, in a very generic way, put in something like corrupted, of course you have telos built into that. A corruption is a missing the mark of something, not meeting its potential, or not even meeting the expectation of its author.
And it also seems to me that you can sell the story that meaning is to be found in responsibility. When I've tried to sell that story to myself, I seem to buy it. And when I've tried to communicate it with other people, it renders them silent. Large crowds of people silent. And that's strange, because I'm not sure why that is. It's perhaps because the connection between responsibility and meaning had never been made in that explicitly somehow. Because meaning gets contaminated with happiness or something like that, but it's to be found in responsibility. And then you could say, well, there isn't any responsibility that's more compelling than trying to aid things in the manifestation of their divine form.
That's a very interesting line. And again, this is material I've gone over before. What's interesting about this compilation is how it's all put together. And what's also interesting about this compilation is because, as of course Jordan Peterson had this conversation with John Vervaeke towards the end of May, if I recall correctly. And of course my conversations and my explorations have been going. And so if you hit something like this now, as opposed to May, it will interact with all of the material that I've done between May and now, and the growth that I've had. So in a sense, I hear it with new ears.
It should be an adventure that could be sold. And I don't know why the church can't do it.
Now, what's interesting here is how often the church comes up in this compilation. Now, today I posted my conversation with Len Vanderzee, which I thought went very well. I was quite happy with how this went, and there was a section in the middle of it when Len gets preaching. Len's a preacher, and he's an excellent preacher, by the way. When Len gets preaching, and he begins to really hit on what worship is, and as he was talking, I very much had this vision of the church in the center and the life of the community radiating out from the church, and Len's cry of despair about the crisis in Protestant worship. And as many noted in the comments, well, this sounds very much in line with Catholic worship and sounds very much in line with Orthodox worship. And he's right. These are two Protestants critiquing our own tradition and, doing some work on that. But part of what kept going through my mind as Len was speaking was how disconnected it has become phenomenologically from people in church and in the world. And that's there are deep things underneath that. Deconstruction has been a very big deal. It's not that people are only deconstructing from churches that don't worship well. And so Jordan, when he's talking about the relationship between meaning and responsibility, well, what did Jordan do? Well, in some ways, he spoke to people who were impoverished of meaning, who were starving for meaning, and said, here, try this. And of course, he's a clinical psychologist, so he gave it to them in very small bites. Okay, start by cleaning up your room. And he didn't just tell people to clean up their room. Many moms have told them to clean up their room. But in a sense, part of what Jordan Peterson told them to do was, while you're cleaning up your room, pay attention to your sense of meaning. And when you have cleaned up your room, pause for a moment and take a look at how you feel. And so it wasn't just selling meaning as responsibility. It was also inviting those who would participate in such a thing to become more self-aware about the relationship between responsibility and meaning. I mean, churches have, for a very long time, not been short on responsibility. In fact, many would complain that churches have been scolds, that churches have been basically, in the words of Jesus, laying burdens upon people that the church leaders themselves are not willing to bear. And that's something that Jesus attacks very forcefully in Matthew chapter 15. So there's a lot going on here. Well, let's listen to a little bit more of this.
I don't understand that. And because it seems to me that that's something that I've done, at least in part. And that accounts for the strange popularity of the biblical lectures in particular.
Yeah.
And
see, it's interesting because, again, this is a compilation. So unless you know the videos very well, you're not really sure which video is this from. And right there you heard Peugeot. And then it's going to quickly switch over to the Vervaeke conversation. And what's fascinating is, again, you can really tell the difference in the Vervaeke conversation from the other conversations when they're all laid side by side like this.
But I've also, and I do believe that. I do believe that the right striving is to attempt with all your heart to encourage things to develop along that towards that divine goal. Like, what else would you possibly do? Once you think that through, it's like you're always aiming at something that's better, or you wouldn't be aiming. You're always moving towards something that's better, or you wouldn't be moving. So then why wouldn't you move towards the greatest good?
Yeah.
Now, I regularly have it that I'm working on a video and I can't bring it to term. And that's been going on in me with John Vervaeke's video where he's working on scaling. And so now I've made two PowerPoints. I used elements of the one PowerPoint in my neo-pagan video, and there'll be elements of the second PowerPoint, and I don't think this PowerPoint will, again, reach its full term. But you'll notice that Peterson, in a variety of his videos, was working on the ideal and the way that the ideal functions. And I've been working quite a bit on, oh, that's the wrong video. That's interesting. OBS hasn't picked up on the switch. All right, here it is. So a lot of what I do with these videos is look for language. And this is very Ian McGilchrist, and that's where you come in as my third lobe, because my right and left hemispheres are working back and forth, and in some ways my right hemisphere keeps moving my mouth in these haphazard ways, and my left hemisphere is watching and looking for something that it can grab onto, because again, the left, this is using McGilchrist's framework, the left is looking to lock something down, and in many ways the way we do that is we get a word for it. And then once we have a word for it, then we can start to construct and build something. And so the word that I've been trying to get at is, the word that I'm using right now for some of this stuff is betterment. You know, so the video that will probably never be is about betterment in scale and narrative. And I eventually give a deal of justification to narrative on both sides, because we're watching narratives go back and forth. But the question of betterment and all the way up to the absolute, that's where I sort of ran aground with this, proximal to absolute. In a secular context, for the sake of pluralistic conversation, Christians deprivileged their systems and looked for common ground. Secularity tried to substitute the monarchical vision for the absolute. Scientific went to the top of the social hierarchy, and this is exactly what you see there when a modernist will say that the scientific is at the top of the hierarchy and must be. The scientific is the thing that can be in the public domain and should govern the creation of law. But part of what we're running into with the recession of modernity is we're finding out just how insufficient that system is, because we are not finally fully capable of a monarchical vision, and we is pretty important in that. It's sort of like we the monarchy. No, we the people. Monarchies are I. They're first person. They're not third person, or they're singular. They're not plural. And so secularity tries to substitute the monarchical vision for the absolute. Scientific went to the top of the social hierarchy. Response to pervasive interpretive pluralism in Christianity, that's part of the reason we went there, looking for a universal platform in order to simulate the old throne of God that looked down upon the whole earth and saw everything at its heart, which is basically about essence. And then the scientific lab leak, removing the subject, replacing it with a monarchical vision. And then where we're sort of at then is in this process, evolutionary biology has sort of been the hotness that everyone has gone to. And so if you listen to Chris Williamson's channel, hope I don't make you a little jealous, Grizz, that I'm mentioning Chris Williamson. Don't feel too bad, Grizz. I've been watching a lot more of your videos than his. If you look at Chris Williamson's channel, he's saying things like, well, I think that evolutionary biology is the way that we can achieve, basically my wording would be the way that we can achieve betterment, because evolutionary biology will give us this universal vision of the universal human, and then we can figure out, once we figure out how the human ticks, we can better the individual to achieve that. But evolutionary biology will tell you nothing about morality. It will tell you how we are and what we do, but it won't tell you how we should be. And so it's all these ideals that Peterson is now fascinated with, that are ideals that has should built into them. If we're hackable, which is sort of the idea behind evolutionary biology and the self-improvement industry, we're well, let's hack ourselves and hack each other for the good. But again, evolutionary biology won't tell you what the good is. Who's doing the hacking? That's always the question. Okay, we're going to hack ourselves. Well, aren't you yourself the product of evolutionary biology? So any agency that you attempt to wield evolutionary biology with is itself the subject of evolutionary biology. That's the problem that C.S. Lewis points out with the whole show in his book Miracles. Proximal betterment suffers from the limitations of the proximal. We want proximal betterment to go on forever, to become an absolute, and we're hoping that we can just sort of step the thing up as it goes. And in a sense, Peterson is saying, no, we strive for an ideal, and that's sort of how we navigate our betterment. And because, in fact, a lot of betterment has to do with proximal, not really corruption, but proximal sacrifice in order to achieve betterment. That's as far as I got on that video.
Yeah. Well, it's because it's terrifying, I suppose, in part. But then, as you know, I've tried to put that into practice in my life, and it's tearing me into pieces.
Yeah.
I asked you to define love, and I'm going to
see. There's the cut to the Vervaeke video.
To define it on my terms now,
Please.
And that is the best in me serving the best in you. And I think that's the deepest pleasure. That's the deepest and most lasting pleasure, and it is the most fundamental motivation. It's the inexhaustible source, because if I can do that, whenever I do that, I feel that I'm being properly.
Well,
and there's nothing better than that.
And you can extend that to the world, to situations, places.
Well, I think that's what you're supposed to do by accepting the proposition that God is love. I mean, it's God is love and God is logos. Those are both there. So then the question, to some degree, is the rank order of the two. And I would say God is truth within love. And that's the animating spirit of mankind. And that's a way different claim than the one the atheists are going after, by the way.
Yeah,
Think about it, everyone. Is truth in the service of love not the best animating spirit of mankind when it isn't pursuing an aberration? We can all ask ourselves that question.
I think that's a good question to ask. I think,
Thank you, John.
No, what I mean,
and again, you can really see the difference in Jordan in that conversation than just in the Peugeot conversation, which was right before.
I think it reorients us to the
We can
fact.
put that on a T-shirt. Is truth in the service of love a good question?
I guess I see them as more. I see them as more interpenetrating. I want to make a stronger relationship between them than just a relationship of service. I mean, this is
How about her, man?
Yeah, that this is why I like the term realization. That love is a way of affording realization, and the deepest knowing we have of.
And you know, Vervaeke's fondness for grabbing realization on a pivot, because of course realization is two-sided, and that's really helpful because you can just pivot the thing around.
Reality is in realization. That's what if I had to.
Okay, so it seems to me. Okay, so I'll make an appendage to my claim.
Right.
The reality that is most justifiable is brought about by the action of truth in the service of love.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is I see truth I think you're using it, and I've heard you use true as something beyond a correspondence between the semantic content of a proposition reality. I've heard.
And right there, with the recession of modernity, we have a recalibration of, what John just described as, I would say, a concordist version of truth, between a semantic thing, and I would not say reality, because I think using reality for, let's say, a physical arrangement is a reduction of what reality is, because reality is so much more than just simply a physical arrangement. That's only one half of the register.
Heard you talk about,
yes,
right, and we even use that when we use the phrase.
Yes,
true
it seems
love.
to incorporate some of those other dimensions that you've been talking about. Okay, well, great, man. So fill me in.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm trying to get at that power is a way of, when your shot is true, your skill has been effective.
And getting at what we're talking about when we use power in that stigmatized social pathological sense, which again I think Andy Crouch's view in Playing God of understanding that power does many things. We use power as a pejorative, and then agency as a good thing, when in many ways power is the ability to manifest something in the world. Basically, the power is the ability that spirit uses to manifest something in the world. That's what power is. And to simply, it's again, it's facile, it's simplistic to somehow denigrate all power as that, and then to go on and use power in order to achieve an end. I mean, it just can't be. It just can't hold together.
And you're going to hit the mark, right? But presence is also a way in which things are true to form, right? And then the participatory knowing is when we're like the deepest sense of true, which is related to trust and being betrothed to the world in an important way.
Maybe I'll pull up another piece of that video that I didn't make. Again, this is what happens. The videos are only partially formed, and they wind up sliding into the videos I can make because I can't put the whole thought together. In the video where John is speaking about scaling, he expresses his anxiety about overuse of narrative. And especially with respect to scale, I don't think there's any way around it. Vervaeke's cognitive science approach is very cautious about fooling ourselves. Andrew Sullivan wrote a rather impassioned Substack about when all the media narratives collapse, and Joe Rogan and Tim Pool. Joe Rogan was on Tim Pool, and Alex Jones was in the room, and I think it's Blair White, and sitting uncomfortably next to Alex Jones, and a whole bunch of other individuals. And Vervaeke has a tremendous point with respect to narrative, and it's on display right now. Truth is more complex than, let's say, the physical layer, especially since the recession of modernity. A monarchical vision propositionally basically simplifies truth into a physical arrangement in a moment. And what we're basically seeing is it's a tremendously useful thing. If I close my eyes and I reach out, I know just where my computer is. And that's because in my mind, I can propositionally express and now participatorily and procedurally interact with the computer that is sitting on my desktop, even if I can't see it, because object permanence, I know exactly where it is. And when I close my eyes, I trust that even if I don't see my computer, I can feel it right here. But persons are cross-pressured in this right now. narrative one because it scales so much. It's super broad developmentally. We start thinking narratively at a very early age, and Vervaeke is right that it isn't natural to us in the sense that if you see, you can't even birth a child apart from the mother. If somehow you could raise if you could raise a thing from test tube to 9 months after gestation, some facsimile to what a human being is, would you actually have a human being? But and the argument would be, well, maybe if you conducted such a process, you could keep such a being from narrative, and they would never think narratively. Empirical validation scales well cross-culturally, but requires locality. Narrative scales beyond geography and temporal locality. It can be carried by text and language, and seeing itself isn't believing. Go back to that "don't sleep, there are snakes" example of the villagers all pointing of the Amazonian tribe pointing to the god on the beach across the river, and the Westerner not seeing a god at all. And they're like, the god is right there. I can't see the god. We are deeply mysterious. And again, in fact, at one level, I know that now that I'm looking beyond my screen and I'm looking at the office here, on one level, I know that the image that I am beholding above me, if I think about what's in the peripheral, and I think what's in the image that I'm beholding in front of me is a product of my brain pasting this together from this particular perspective. And I have a map in my mind that includes the computer that is here in front of me. And so in some ways I can engage with this non-narratively, but that's still a function of my ability to see. And this is the destruction of of some older philosophical and scientific assumptions of perception. Narrative is just this powerful compression engine. Not only does it take into account physical, locale, and time and space, it brings in upper and lower register. You're not going to have a court case without getting into meaning. Meaning does not reside in the lower register. Meaning resides in the upper register. And it includes chronos and process. Narrative is able to compress that into the narrative. It also includes community, and community is baked into every narrative. You can't actually construct a narrative apart from the community that births the language and the imagery and the symbolism and the metaphor upon which the narrative depends. And I just think that there's so much sunk cost already into narrative that trying to change it is just simply impossible. It's I'm not a brain scientist at all, but in the same way that we're constructing. So I just bought a new computer, and the new computer that I bought just has the integrated Iris, the new Intel's new integrated graphics, and I don't know if I'm going to keep that computer or I'm going to return it so I can get something with NVIDIA graphics in it, but that comes at a price premium, and it's not necessarily the features that I want in that computer. But to what degree haven't our entire bodies have been shaped by history? The example of the fact that if you look at a chimpanzee, the chimpanzee is very barrel-chested and has a tremendous amount of intestine. Why? Because it's eating leaves, and you need all of that intestine to somehow derive the tiny traces of nutrients that are in those leaves. Human beings cook, and over periods of time, evolutionary biology says that we have outsourced, outside of our skin-covered sacks, we have outsourced that part of our digestion into fire-laden vessels. And that just shows you the strange way in which individualism is a limited tool, because I, in fact, go far beyond what I am in this video and what I am covered by skin. I outsource my digestion to procedural knowledge. So, and in fact, in many ways, even though procedural knowledge isn't in itself simply narrative, narrative is just so pervasive that it could well be that, sort of like Intel or NVIDIA optimizes their chips for, well, for example, running MP4s, which is I'm actually not recording an MP4, but they monetize, they build into the chip, so they get it into the hardware level so they can decompress common video and audio codexes so that it's less, they don't have to keep running that through the CPU or the GPU, but they basically code it into the hardware. How much narrative hasn't been simply coded into our hardware by now? That's when I get into the Betterment, proximal, and absolute.
So it will allow me to expand what you mean by true to cover all of those dimensions.
Betrothed to the world, in that you extend the same courtesy to the world that you described extending to your partner.
And I would say, even when you say something like betrothed to the world, you have simply triggered narrative within us, so that our imagination is filled with couples in love and fidelity and sacrifice. Narrative is just so quickly on the tip of our minds.
Exactly. I think the answer to nihilism isn't some propositional answer. This is what I get from Nishitani.
Yeah, right.
It's to relearn, and I mean this deeply, like in the Buddhist sense of sati, to remember what it is to fall in love with reality, to fall in love with being. And if that's what you're saying is the
Now, do you
animating
think that's
thing,
what Sam Harris is striving for in his spirituality? Well, and it's not a throwaway answer. It's like, what's he up to exactly? I mean, isn't he on a Sophia, finally a Sophia adventure?
I think everybody is, how can I put this? Everybody lives from the non-propositional kinds of knowing emphasized by Plato. And that's what all of the scholastic research is pointing to now, that Socrates was trying to point people to the non-propositional knowing, the procedural, the perspectival, the participatory. I think we all have to live from that, given a lot of things I've said and a lot of things we've said.
Well,
together.
maybe you could expound on those a bit more for us and clarify a bit more. And so you said the answer to nihilism, that isn't.
It's interesting also because, well, so Peterson has a couple, there's Dave Rubin on the Rubin Report has a couple videos out with Peterson, and I haven't gone through the second one. The second one has quite a bit more in it from the first one, but Peterson keeps coming around to the propositional, and that's part of the reason why he says he doesn't like the question, does he believe in God? Basically, because he sees, and I'm going to rephrase it as, it's overly propositionally laden. And this is where Peterson is such an interesting mix of evolution in a context of the recession of modernity. Because on one hand, his IDW self and his scientific self so hard wants to hold on to modernity and what it's been given. His sunk costs in science are all right there. And this is where I get the image that from his conversation with Peugeot, where, modernity is receding, and Jonathan Peugeot, in a sense, says, jump, jump. And Peterson's, well, I don't know where jumping would land me.
That isn't exactly a comment on my comment that the culture war is about a claim that the drive to power is at the core of Western being.
I think that's an equally nihilistic claim. That's my point. The claim
The claim is nihilistic, or my claim about that is nihilistic, or both?
That power is a fundamental reality is an attempt to assuage the wounding of nihilism, but it is fundamentally mistaken in its endeavor. It is constituted the wrong way. It's like framing a problem the wrong way, so that you do not get the insight needed to get to the solution of the problem. So I think of it as a fundamental misframing. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay,
and that's why I'm hesitant to say either yes or no to it, because
I get it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I believe that it is misframed, because I don't think it would be taking us in such a pathological direction. The whole argument,
exactly, if
it wasn't misframed. Thinking psychologically again about Christianity, and I know that Christianity is an extension of.
If I recall from this morning, I think this is the. I just mentioned his name, Blackmore. This is the Blackmore conversation, and I'm not sure if I listened to this one.
Other metaphysical forms of thought, but that predated. But it looked to me like, and some of those were derived from Mesopotamia, and some of them were derived from Greece, and some of them were derived from Judaism and other sources. But they all seem to me to be part of the conversation that human beings have been having amongst themselves for thousands of years about what the nature of the ideal human being is. And I see these cathedrals, these works of art in architecture that took a tremendous amount of labor, produce a dome-like structure that represents the sky, and you see Christ as logos spread out on the sky as a transcendent force. And you ask yourself, well, what?
Andrew Blackwood. That's I got the part in the middle right.
Exactly is that signifying? And the answer is at least the proposition of a kind of ideal that's associated with, let's say, universal love and truth in speech. That's the logos, summed up in two phrases. And if there's no metaphysical reality there at all, there's still this imaginative enterprise that characterizes the entire human, imaginative effort, cultural effort to posit a transcendent ideal that we would live in relationship to. And I just don't see that case being made very strongly, and I can't really understand why, because isn't it rather obvious that at least part of what Christianity has been is the attempt by thousands of people over thousands of years to specify the nature of an ideal?
I can't understand why it isn't being made. Well, it's maybe not being made in your circles so much. That would be the academy, and the reason it isn't being made is because the academy has decided it's not welcome. And you can see Dallas Willard's video from the Veritas Forum about worldview. You can read George Marsden's work. This was intentionally taken out of the universities. It was intentionally, and that followed in some ways, just like the lab leak, the recognition that taking out the subject can afford a certain kind of knowledge with respect to the world, and then that gets out of the scientific lab and gets out into the wild, and it gets applied to everything. That lab leak in many ways is what destroyed the idea in the university, because now suddenly this kind of knowledge becomes the only kind of knowledge that we have any certainty about, because we had certainty of it in small physical cases, and therefore basically we're running this social experiment and it's being run into the ground. And Peterson is one of the few that says, hey, wait a minute. And the rest would say, don't go there. Don't go there.
Certainly, I would say so. And I would say that the fact that these principles actually work is proof of their proof of there being true accounts of what the nature of the real is. Well, let's approach this from a couple of different angles, Jordan. The first is mean, one of the things that I profoundly believe is that, these young people seeking, deeper answers, and, to however much they may be flailing about, it's not their fault that many, perhaps most of the institutions they will encounter will betray that which is deepest in them, will denigrate, will tell them, no, none of these things that you're seeking are really real. I mean, I think, I've been thinking a lot over the years about architecture and what is going on in brutalist architecture. And it really does seem to me that in brutalist architecture, to live in relation to brutalist architecture, it is as if you had a parent that said, you're nothing. You're nothing. You'll never amount to any. I mean, of course, there are terrible people, terrible to say people actually, there are people in these situations who live with such dysfunctional lack of love and antagonism. This is the way that the home life that some people terribly have. But I'm using this as an example because I think what brutalist architecture does is it declares to the whole world and to you that there is no truth. There is no beauty. You are nothing. Accept it. It's just a concrete annihilating force. And you see this culture of repudiation. I mean, here in not here, you're in Canada, I'm in the States, in Savannah now. But the Chateau Laurier, I think I misspoke recently, called it the Frontenac, which is in Quebec. But in Ottawa, the Chateau Laurier, there's been a desire to expand this sort of beautiful sort of neo-Gothic building, and it went.
I'm going to jump ahead in this conversation. So then in the Peugeot, Vervaeke, Blackwood, the next one is a bit from the Bishop Barron conversation.
Yes.
And out Adam and Eve.
Yes.
Reborn.
Yes. Yes.
The incorporation of the host is the embodiment. It's the incarnation of Christ within. That's what it's acting out. That's the idea. I mean, in some sense, it's the consumption of the saving element, but the saving element is actually a mode of being. And this isn't hit home. It's like, look what the church demands everything of you.
Yeah.
Absolutely everything. And the reason that people are leaving is because that adventure isn't being put before them.
Yes.
It's like, look, you can.
And okay, that adventure isn't being put before them. And again, I look at the admonition to clean your room, but it wasn't just the admonition to clean your room, because in many ways, someone telling you to clean your room, the telos of cleaning your room is a clean room. But when Jordan Peterson makes that assertion, the telos of cleaning your room is noticing the stimulation and the achievement of meaning via the avenue of cleaning your room.
Have
Yes.
your cars and your money and all of that, but
Yes.
that's nothing compared to the adventure that you could be going on.
Yes, I wish you'd preach to our people, because I think you're absolutely right about that. The language we'd use is be a saint. That's the ordinary goal of every baptized person, is to be a saint.
And part of the difficulty we have with that is similar to the difficulty with this crisis of Protestant worship that Len and I were talking about. When people hear saint, and this is a vestige of before the moral alignment switched, was that a saint is a saint is someone who is troublesome to have around for you because they're self-righteous. And that, of course, is not what a saint is about. To go back to, I should pull up that quote. A community needs ethical people, but does the secular world need religious people? Pay attention to the language. Are the saints really good? Is religious piety a prerequisite for communal virtue? Do we need God in order to love our fellow man? Now notice, again, the Christian virtue of love is not displaced, But the question about, I was going to say how love is achieved, but in some ways I think that's insufficient. The question of how love is bid to come. What do I mean by that? We all, those of us who have tried to love, know that love is a challenge that can break you. And so the capacity to love one's neighbor is a gift. And the gift has to come from somewhere else. Every 12-stepper who is looking for a power greater than themselves knows this. And for all of us who wish to love, to look for love, must know that we need a power greater than ourselves to occupy us and to flow through us in order to love the other. These questions occurred to me with increasing frequency as the deep significance of the moral dimension of life came clear to me. I looked around to find enlightenment. I had to admit to myself that no easy answer to these questions could be found merely by noting the way in which different types of people, religious and irreligious, behaved. It was not possible to study us and say, "There, that proves you must be religious, for only the pious are good." People continually leap out of all categories we tried to put them in and behave in totally unexpected ways. The most important lessons I learned is that there's no cut and dried categories in human life. Is he a nominalist? No easily recognizable brand names by which we estimate our fellows. Over and over, respectable people, one of the commonest labels applied to social intercourse, turned out to be uncooperative, irritable, and at worst dishonest. Conversely, many who were neither respectable nor pious were in fact valiant. At the same time, many obvious bums were just plain bums. It was the mystery, the richness, and the surprise of human beings that struck me the most when I looked around at my fellows. This is the portion of the book where he talks about Eric Liddell, the man for whom the movie Chariots of Fire was made. The man who more than anyone brought about the solution to the teenage problem was Eric. I'll just use his real name. He just uses a false name here. Eric Liddell. It is rare indeed when a person has the good fortune to meet a saint, but he came as close to any I have ever known. Often in an evening of the last year, I, headed for some pleasant rendezvous with my girlfriend, would pass the game room and peer in to see what the missionaries had cooking for the teenagers. As often as not, Eric Liddell would be bent over a chessboard or a model boat, or directing some sort of square dance, absorbed, warm, interested, pouring all of himself into this effort to capture the minds and imaginations of those penned-up youths. If anyone could have done it, he could. A track man, he had won the 440 in the Olympics for England in the 20s, and then had come to China as a missionary. In a camp, he was in his mid-40s, lithe and springy of step, and above all, overflowing with good humor and love of life. This again is in a camp. Are we merely the sum of the whole show around us? Or are there spirits that can inhabit us and transform us and change us into something that we can never imagine we could be? He was aided by others, to be sure, but it was Eric's enthusiasm and charm that carried the day with the whole effort. Shortly before the camp ended, he was stricken suddenly with a brain tumor and died the same day. The entire camp, especially the youths, were stunned for days, so great was the vacuum that Eric's death had left. There was a quality seemingly unique in the missionary group, namely, naturally and without pretense, to respond to a need which everyone else recognized only to turn aside. Much of this went unnoticed, but our camp could scarcely have survived as well as it did without it. If there was any evidence of the grace of God observable on the surface of our camp existence, there it was to be found. As I looked at those who represented the Christian world in Weixing, with all our pride and failings, and yet the graces that appear now again and again, I was continually reminded of Reinhold Niebuhr's remark that religion is not the place where the problem of man's egotism is automatically resolved. Rather, it is there that the ultimate battle between human pride and God's grace takes place. Insofar as human pride may win the battle, religion can and does become one of the instruments of human sin. But insofar as the self does meet God and so surrenders to something beyond its own self-interest, religion may provide the one possibility for much needed and very rare release from our common self-concern.
A saint means someone who's holy or utterly conformed to Christ. Now, press that. To be conformed to Christ means you're willing to go into the dysfunction of the world, to bear its pain, and to bear to it the ever greater divine mercy and love. Now fill in the blank. Francis of Assisi. Mother Teresa, maybe in our time, like when we were younger, if someone said, well, who's a living saint? We all would have said Mother Teresa. Well, what did she do? She went into the worst slum in the world. I've been there. And she bore the suffering of the world, literally picking up the dying and bearing their disease and bearing their psychological suffering. And she took on herself the wounds of Jesus. But then think of the smile of Mother Teresa. She brought to that place the ever greater, more superabundant mercy of Christ. That's being a saint. And you're dead right. I think we're not sufficiently calling our people to that kind of heroic.
I can tell you one thing I've experienced.
And I think part of it is not just calling our people to it. It has to be borne witness to. I can't imagine the youth that Eric Liddell served forgot him.
This is really something to see. I spoke in about 150 cities sequentially with a day or two in between, and to large audiences, 3,000 to 10,000 all the time, something like that. And I always paid attention to the audience singly because I was always talking to one person at a time, but also en masse, to see, to hear. Because if the words are landing in the right place and hypothetically emanating from the proper source, then there's silence. And sometimes that silence can be dramatic. And that's why people say, well, you could have heard a pin drop. It's no one's moving because their attention is 100% gripped by whatever just happened. And one thing that reliably elicited that was the proposition that the meaning that sustains you and protects you from corruption during suffering is to be found in responsibility. And people that...
See, I'm not sure of his premise. I've known many people who have taken up responsibility to have it embitter them. And I think that happens when they recognize that, first of all, it's not a free taking up of responsibility. And Peterson makes that point often. It has to be a free taking up of responsibility. But it also has to be a taking up of responsibility that falls within a narrative where the sacrifice is made, in some cases, irregardless of the outcomes that are evident. Well, again, the biblical language just flows to my mind. Will achieve, or it's actually C.S. Lewis, will achieve a weight of glory. Well, C.S. Lewis gets it from the Bible. And that narratival power. Okay, so we're talking about saints. So I think about my father. Did my father ever do a miracle? Well, he probably wouldn't make canon, Roman Catholic canonization. And I think the miracle test is actually quite a good one. But let's assume degrees of sainthood. Many who knew my father counted him as a saint. He was not a perfect man. He was my father. I knew his imperfections. But he did indeed pour his life out for the people of the First Ward of Peterson. Check that off your bingo. And when I visited Peterson, I hadn't visited Peterson probably since my parents left it in 98. I had visited New York City in 2006, and I was struck by the transformation that had happened in New York City from the New York City that I knew in the 80s when I was growing up in New Jersey, There's another bingo. And the New York City that I found in the New York City of Friends and Sex and the City in 2006 when I visited Redeemer Press and Tim Keller. It was a place transformed. What happened to all the grime? What happened to, so much of it was cleaned up, and it was full of young, healthy, beautiful people walking around. It's like, wow, that was not the grimy place I knew from the 70s and 80s. And then I visited Peterson in 2013 for the memorial service of my father. And if you're curious about the memorial service, you can find it on my channel. You have to dig a ways because I've made a lot of videos since then. But Peterson was just as grimy as it was when I left it in the 80s and 90s. So my father labored in Peterson, and there are shining elements of his labors: Habitat for Humanity. NARC was gone by that point, but the heroin wave was past. The church is still there, different, perhaps diminished. But did he labor in vain? Because, in the words of the psalmist, his place knew him no more. And I would say no, because in the words of Hebrew 11, he was laboring for a heavenly city, and not a city that just simply remains in the clouds, but one that will come down to earth. And again, in Hebrews 11, he didn't see it with his eyes, but he knew that he did not labor in vain. And so it's not simply responsibility. It's responsibility with hope and joy that, despite looking around in this world where we might not see the evidence of the fruit of our labor, that fruit is eternal. When I worked in the Dominican Republic as a missionary right out of seminary, I was talking to a couple today who were in a church that had a missionary right out of seminary, and the missionary came in so full of himself in that case, and did a lot of damage in the church. It's not an uncommon story. And perhaps if I had gone to the Dominican, if I've gone someplace other than the Dominican Republic right out of seminary, I would be so full of myself and imagining what I could accomplish that I would have done a similar thing to a church. But the depth of difficulty in the Dominican Republic was sufficient to squash any triumphalistic enthusiast dream of somehow rescuing this group of Haitians who were, for the most part, illegal, working for the government, cutting cane and picking coffee. And an important part of my own journey was that I had the triumphalism crushed out of me. And I had my classical exam after spending 9 months in the Dominican Republic, and I got in trouble with one of the pastors in Classis Grand Rapids East when I expressed some of what I learned from the Haitians. They had a very deep sense that in all likelihood they would die young, poor, in a land that was not their home. And maybe, just maybe, their children have a little better life, but as by no means secure. Certainly, they were not having a meaning crisis. Their lives were full of meaning. But it was not worthless meaning.
And I thought part of the reason that produced silence was because no one says that now. They say happiness, or they say rights, or they say privileges, or they say reward, or something like that. They don't say pick up the heaviest load you can carry or care for that matter, and stumble forward. And
it's quite amazing that in a consumerist society, this is something. Again, there's deeply something about the voluntary aspect of it. that is deeply connected to meaning. But for the Haitians, it was work or die.
I've seen people cut those ideas and put them on T-shirts and play with them. And so it's not that the church is asking too little of its people.
I'm recommending that we remember.
Okay, now back to the Vervaeke talk. So again, the person that did this compilation, they knew what they were doing.
That meaning in life, and this is also something I'm doing empirical work on, right? That meaning in life is mostly bound, right, at the non-propositional level, and it does feed into things like sacredness. I think reverence is the proper virtue of awe. Reverence is the virtue that helps us appropriate awe.
And that will certainly give you reason to understand why religions throughout history have been enormously meaningful, because you take the awe and the reverence and the responsibility and the voluntarism, and if you really pursue that can very much be part of the road to sainthood. But again, there's always the other element, which I think Gilkey in his book bears witness to, even though Gilkey lost his faith, I believe. That the power to love and the strength to persevere finally flows as a gift to us from someone and somewhere else.
Means it is hold in ritual, is hold as a marker or as a pointer for ritual emulation.
I think
and that's embodiment. That's the pulling in of that personality into the self.
I think that's right, but I think awe is really interesting, because you can measure this. Awe is one of the few instances where people's sense of self and egocentrism is shrunk, but they find it a positive experience and they want it to continue.
And awe is, of course, central to worship. And what Len Van de Zee was talking about in terms of the crisis is that awe that that comes upon us, that comes over us, that fills us, then moves us to responsibility, to sacrifice.
That's what we experience in relationship to our current ego when we hypothesize our ideal as well.
I think that's right, and that goes to Agnes.
I mean, those are the same things.
And of course, in the context of worship, you're surrounded by a community and an institution, and those who will help remind you of the ideal and instantiations of the ideal.
Because awe is the ideal. Awe is our unconscious ideal capturing us. Think about it. It's the spirit within. So imagine this. You already admitted, so to speak, that we're, canonic representations of the central animating spirit of the ages. And that speaks from our unconscious, because it's embodied within us, and then it finds its grip on us in awe, in admiration.
Would you say though? There's a question. Like, would you say that it's not only the unconscious within us, but the unconscious without us? Because I think what awe is doing is disclosing.
It's the unconscious in the books behind you.
Yes, and also the unconscious in the world. Because I think part of what we're I think we got too locked into the notion of the sacred as perfection, completion. This is one of my critiques of Plato, although I'm normally a lover of Plato. And I think you can see in the mystics and in many traditions, this is a claim I can back up, but I'm just going to throw it out there. Right, even in Jonathan's tradition, Eastern Orthodoxy,
is the sacred the good becoming better?
Well, the sacred is an inexhaustibleness, right? And
yes, that's why I'm asking that question.
Yes.
Because when I've had visions of heaven is a place that's perfect and getting better.
That's a further up and further in. Lewis, The Last Battle. That's a great point that Peterson makes there.
Okay, let me give you my sense, the place where I don't have visions, but the place where I experience what I'm talking about.
I wouldn't recommend them necessarily.
Yeah, well, I mean, We can compare altered states of consciousness another time, perhaps.
Yeah, okay. You'd really like to do that, would you?
Well, let me just finish the point I was making. So for me,
go on before on to another universe, you mean?
Yeah. See, for me, I tell people that Plato is sacred, which does not mean I can't question him. It does not mean that I can't disagree with him. It means the following: Plato transforms me. I go out and live my life for a while. The world then changes me because of the way I've been changed. I come back and I see things in Plato I didn't see before. And then I go back to the world. The thing is, the
Bible does that for people.
Yes, and that's why the Bible is sacred. And what Plato, I think, argues, and what Taoism argues, and I think Christianity argues, where there's also the book of nature. There's always the two books of Revelation. You can actually experience that with respect to nature. I don't particularly like that term, but you can experience that with where the world.
I think introverts do that in particular. I that's a hypothesis of mine. I don't have evidence for it, but I've noticed my introverted clients need to be renewed by nature. When I've tried to reduce this, I mean, that experience of awe. So we went to a whole conference on that. So if you see someone that you really admire, that shades into awe, and you can see that in the effect that celebrities have on.
Now I think it's back to Peugeot.
On the public. It can be paralyzing. So the admiration, there's a continuum between admiration and awe. And then you can easily make the case, I think, that admiration is the felt sense of the instinct to imitate. So you see children, maybe they'll hero worship someone, and then they'll imitate them, they'll copy them. They find someone who's in that zone of proximal development, and they start to copy them. Or they'll take on the identity of a hero or heroine in a movie. My little granddaughter, who's 3, for a year now, literally a year, she has 2 names, Scarlett and...
No, I don't think this is Peugeot. I'm out of time, so I've got to go. But yeah, find the podcast. I know some of you are just kind of YouTube only, and some of you have found this already, but it's one of the better pieces. The compiler did an excellent job putting it together, and it really flows nicely, and there's a lot of stuff in it. So I'm not sure what day I'll release this, but thanks for listening. Leave a comment.